Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 229, How the Habsburgs Gained Spain. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, though happy Austria marry, is one of the few terms that almost anyone with a cursory interest in European history knows. It's only rivaled by that Voltaire quote, "Thou shalt not utter in my presence ever." It evokes the image of a handsome alpine boy, full of charm and apple strudel, wooing some princess into peacefully handing over the richest lands in Europe. And this narrative of the peaceful transition to a benign dynasty is another one of the great propaganda successes of the House of Habsburg. The saying was attributed to Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, who had once occupied Vienna, then to the humanist Ulrich von Hutten, but first evidence of its use dates back to 1654, more than 150 years after the famous marriages that made an empire. From 1680 onwards, it was read out at Habsburg weddings to emphasize the peaceful nature of its rulers. It definitely did not originate in the days of Maximilian I, when all these dynastic alliances were formed and bore fruit. Talking about a gentle and peaceful transfer of power was preposterous against the backdrop of a 15-year-long war over the succession to the Grand Dukes of Burgundy, and the roller coaster ride that is today's topic, the way the Habsburgs acquired the crown of Spain. But before we start, just a quick message about merch. Most podcasts offer you merchandise, t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, phone cases. I have not yet done so, even though many of you have asked, because of the economics. If I offer, for example, a t-shirt at £30, which is actually quite a lot of money, I think, at a stretch, I would get £10 out of that, because the rest is taken up by the printers, the postage, the kneecappers at PayPal and Stripe, etc., etc. But I found a solution, which is do it yourself. I've put a chunk of the History of the Germans episode art on my website for you to download. It's under the section for travel, maps and merch. And just choose one or as many images as you want, take them to a printer near where you live and put them on your crockery, your clothing or communication devices as you want. It is, like the show itself, entirely free. Well, unless, of course, you feel compelled to join the band of generous knights, princes and electors who are supporting the show on historyofthegermans.com/support. Generous souls like Michael R., Joachim C., David M., Daniel McG., Thomas J. H., and Alice D. And with that, back to the show. Now today, we'll be wandering well off the reservation. Most of this episode will deal with Spanish history, and since this is the history of the Germans, and despite having a sister living in Madrid, my knowledge of Spanish history is patchy, to say it mildly. Hence there will be even more of these mistakes, odd perspectives, and butchering of foreign language that you normally can expect. And for that I beg forgiveness in advance. I will let you know next week where I went wrong, and I will correct as necessary. But let's start on familiar territory. As we heard last week, by 1500, after the humiliation at Livorno, the defeat in the Swabian/Swiss War, and the de facto deposition by the Imperial Diet of Augsburg, Maximilian found himself far out in the wilderness. He spent his time reforming the administrative and military structure of his lands in Austria and Tyrol, and waited. His irrelevance in a domestic context was matched by an even more profound irrelevance in a European context. The continent's politics had descended into a feeding frenzy where the bait were the immensely rich cities and states of the Italian peninsula. In this game, there were no friends or allies. Everybody was a potential ally and a potential enemy at the same time. I've read through the accounts of the different leagues and treaties between 1496 and 1505, and I had to keep a separate sheet with dates and notes to get my head around it. And quite frankly, taking you guys through it will not only be fiendishly complicated, but also terribly confusing and, worse, boring. So rather than tracing all this who went with who when, let's take a broad brush look at it. There were now two emerging superpowers, Spain and France. They both wanted the whole of the Italian peninsula. France held Milan and worked its way north to south. Spain, or more precisely the Kingdom of Aragon, had Sicily, and its main interest lay in Naples, and from there wanted to move northwards. The remaining Italian states were fighting for their survival. Of those, two were still with significant weight, Venice and the papacy. The others, including Florence, had to wiggle between these rolling stones, hoping not to be crushed. As for the nominal feudal overlord of most of Italy, the Holy Roman Emperor, his authority was limited to legitimizing the land transfers and titles. The imperial diet at Augsburg had made it clear that there was an exactly zero chance that a gigantic army of Teutonic knights and Landsknechte was coming across the Alps at any moment. Maximilian's exhausted lands could at best contribute a few thousand soldiers to whoever he had just sided with. Good soldiers may have swayed this or that battle, but for 5 years at least, Maximilian was no longer sitting at the top table. Things brightened up a little for our hero in around 1505. As we discussed last week, Maximilian had defeated his domestic opponents in the War of the Landshut Succession and had then sealed that victory through his magnanimous settlement of the underlying inheritance dispute. With that, he had become more powerful inside the empire than he had ever been before. Well, that's still not much. It does not mean that he could command the princes to follow him to Rome, but it meant there was once again a non-zero probability that he could bring some power of the empire to bear. And another thing had changed in Maximilian himself. For 30 years, ever since his marriage to Marie of Burgundy, Maximilian had fought the French. This struggle had become not just a fight for power, but had turned into personal animosity. This string of events, the fight over Marie's inheritance, the rejection of his daughter Margaret as a bride to Charles VIII, the stealing, in inverted commas, of Anne of Brittany, all that had created so much bad blood. A reconciliation between Maximilian and Louis XII of France seemed almost inconceivable. Yet, still it happened. These years of irrelevance had shifted something. The internal struggle between the desire for revenge and the needs of realpolitik was won, surprisingly, by rationality. In no small way, thanks to the administrations of his son Philip the Handsome, relations between France and the emperor were thawing. The fundamental driver of this reconciliation was, however, not Italy but Spain, or more precisely, the kingdom of Isabella of Castile, which is why I will now rattle on about Spanish domestic politics for about half an hour. So let's wind back to 1496. The double marriage between, on the one hand, the heir to the Spanish crown Juan and Margaret of Austria, daughter of Maximilian, and on the other hand, the heir to Burgundy, Austria, and most probably the imperial crown, Philip the Handsome, to Juana, the third child of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand. As we pointed out in episode 222, this marriage was not the grand diplomatic coup for Maximilian it was later portrayed as. It was in fact a highly risky and imbalanced agreement. Margaret and Philip were the only surviving Habsburgs. All the other lines, the Albertinians and the Leopoldinian dukes we encountered in the episodes 204 to 208, well, they had all died out. Not a single one left. Hence, the rather large territorial complex of Austria and Burgundy, plus the option on the imperial crown, would go to either Philip's or Margaret's descendants, unless, of course, Maximilian would have more children with Bianca Maria Sforza, which he did not. And under the agreement, it was specifically stated that if Philip died without heirs, all of his lands would go to Margaret's heirs, aka her husband Juan and whoever his heirs were. But on the flip side, if Juan died without offspring, all his lands would go to his elder sister, Isabella. Only if she died without heirs would Juana and her children with Philip inherit. But that was a bit of a long shot. The only reason Maximilian agreed to the match was therefore not because he thought it would bring him Spain, but because he needed support from the Spanish monarchs for his grand plan to crush Louis XII. As always with these weddings, the process was lengthy and only completed and legally watertight when the marriage was consummated. That meant that even though the proxy marriages were agreed on November 5, 1495 in Mechelen, with the Spanish ambassador Riojas standing in for both Juan and Juana, nothing was done until the deed was done. And that caused a logistical problem. Spain and the Netherlands were 1,000 miles apart, and the fastest route was by sea, along the English coast and then down across the Bay of Biscay. I am currently planning my summer holiday, which includes a trip across the bay. And whilst this may be fast, it was certainly not safe to do in a 15th century vessel in autumn or winter. And then there was the French Navy, who may be keen to intercept this alliance. Plus, there was this question of who would send whose daughter first. In principle, they could sail in separate fleets and then cross paths halfway, meaning that they each arrive at roughly the same time. That idea was rejected on the basis that it was, for one, too expensive for the cash-strapped Maximilian to furnish a fleet, and nor did the two monarchs trust each other to actually send a daughter when they said they would. So the solution was that Ferdinand and Isabella put Juana on a ship to go to the Netherlands with the proviso that Margaret would then travel back on that same fleet. That way, Margaret was in the hands of the Spanish as soon as she got on her ship, which meant the time window for misbehavior was supposedly tighter. Juana set off from Laredo in Spain, not in Texas of course, in the middle of the night on August 22nd. Though this was supposed to be a reasonable time of year, the 22 ships were bashed about by storms and had to seek refuge in England. It took them until September 19th, so almost a month before Juana arrived in Holland. On the approach to the harbour, one ship with allegedly 700 men and the princess's wardrobe sank after hitting a sandbank. Bad omens. And nobody was prepared for their arrival. The groom was actually at the time travelling in the Empire. So Juana waited in Antwerp until on October 19th the most consequential European wedding took place in the small town of Leer. It is said that the bride and groom were so instantly attracted to each other that the marriage was consummated on that same night. More about that story later. And then it was time for Margaret to get on board the fleet and sail down to Spain. But that could not happen right away. The ships that Juana had travelled on had sustained severe damage during the journey and needed to be fixed. Plus we are now in late autumn. Nobody in their right mind goes out in November to brave the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay, at least nobody sensible. So they did the sensible thing, they waited until the end of January. Now, if Juana's trip was tough, this one was worse. Again, a bit of weather routing could have helped, but neither did they have weather routing at the time, nor would it have been politically possible for Margaret to wait until May, when the crossing would have been a lot more comfortable. Because in that case, Ferdinand and Isabella would have concluded that they had been duped and would refuse to participate in Maximilian's grand plan. So the poor girl was put on a boat and sent off. Now this journey was even worse than that of her sister-in-law. They sought shelter in Southampton in February, but they still had to go out again as soon as the weather had calmed down at least somewhat. During one of those storms in the middle of the Bay of Biscay, Margaret was certain that she was going to die, and she wrote her own epitaph. Here lies Margaret, the willing bride, twice married, but a virgin when she died. Still, she made it to Santander in March, having spent more than a month at sea. After a few days of recovery, Juan and Margaret were made husband and wife in Burgos on April 3, 1497, in a tremendously opulent ceremony, as the Venetian ambassador reported back home. There is something unusual about this set of siblings, because not only did Juana and Philip have the hots for each other, Margaret and Juan appeared almost immediately to be deeply in love. Such passion between recipients of dynastic marriage arrangements was unusual, even though it ran a bit in the family. Maximilian and Marie had experienced something similar, and so had Friedrich III and Eleanor of Portugal. In this case, the young couple, she was 17 and he was 18, were taking to long breakfasts in bed, and spent more time than protocol demanded in each other's company. Courtiers became concerned about the state of health of the young prince. He'd always been frail, suffering from a range of ailments, and was now pale and often out of breath. They wrote to Juan's mother, Isabella of Castile, that the couple should be told to take it down a notch, at least for a while. The queen refused, even overruling her husband, King Ferdinand, arguing that marriage was sacrosanct. By September, Juan was already too weak to accompany the court to the wedding of his sister Isabella to King Manuel of Portugal. Juan and Margaret travelled to Salamanca to recover at the palace of the local bishop. Juan probably suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and smallpox. Things deteriorated into late September so that Ferdinand was so alarmed he travelled to his son's sickbed, only to see him die on October 4th. Contemporaries blamed the sexual demands of young Margaret for the death of the prince. This idea that the prince and with it the Spanish monarchy died of love has been recounted again and again and makes for good podcasting material. But it is largely dismissed by modern historians as a case of finding a moral answer to a random event. There is no indication throughout her long life that Margaret had particularly excessive sexual desires. Plus, death by love does not kill healthy young men. At best, it can accelerate existing conditions. So, no, she did not shag him to death. But dead he was. His death was, however, not yet enough to propel the Habsburgs to the throne of Spain. And with Juan dead, the next in line was his older sister Isabella, who had just married King Manuel of Portugal. Isabella soon thereafter gave birth to a boy, Miguel, who was set to inherit the whole of the Iberian Peninsula and all the lands that the Spanish and Portuguese were taking over in America, in Africa and Asia right around now. But Isabella died giving birth to little Miguel, and then little Miguel passed away, just 2 years old, in the arms of his desolate grandmother Isabella of Castile. And at that point, the next eldest daughter, Juana, became the heir to the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and then after her, her son with Philip the Handsome, a boy named Charles, the future emperor Charles V. At least on paper. For now, Isabella and Ferdinand were still very much alive, and their two kingdoms weren't yet absolutist states where any odd ruler was acceptable as long as he or she had the right lineage. These were still two very much separate kingdoms with separate representative bodies, the Cortes, different cultures and historically different political alliances. More importantly, royal succession in both, but particularly in Castile, had been a mess. Not too long ago, Queen Isabella of Castile had herself risen to the throne in a civil war. She had disputed the rights of King Henry IV's daughter, who she argued was illegitimate. This was the last gasp of a rather complex set of wars of succession that date back to the expiry of the House of Barcelona in 1410. Aragon was a bit more stable, but they too had their own internal conflicts. So what I'm trying to say here is that being the eldest child of the current rulers of Castile and Aragon is a great starting point, but no guarantee of succession. Now, one of the ways to improve the chances of succession is, of course, showing up, shaking hands, making speeches, reassuring people of their positions, just generally pressing the flesh. Which is why Philip and Juana boarded the next best ship for Spain as soon as they heard the sad news of the unexpected passing of little Prince Miguel. No. It took them 2 years to get to Spain. What had gotten into the way was one of the wackiest marriage alliances ever contemplated. King Louis XII of France had offered to marry his only child, his daughter Claude, to Charles, the aforementioned 2-year-old son and heir to Philip and Juana, and the future emperor. Now, this marriage would have united France, Spain, Italy, and the empire into one colossal monarchy. Imagine if that had happened, and if it had worked. Then the continent would have been spared centuries of internecine warfare. Martin Luther would have ended up on a pyre, his name a footnote in that eternal list of failed church reformers. And together with the colonies, it would have created a world power rivaled only by India and China. Or the continent would have atrophied into a gently declining, uncompetitive state where independent thought had difficulty to cut through and all resources were sucked up into its capital, wherever that was. Anyway, this idea was obviously so utterly bonkers that nobody really believed that Charles and Claude would ever get married. They were 2 and 3 years old at the time, and who knows what would happen in the 10 years before that marriage could be consummated. Still, negotiations took place and a detailed treaty was slowly taking shape. The treaty involved all the major players, Louis XII and Philip the Handsome as the fathers of the bride and groom, Maximilian and Ferdinand of Aragon as the grandparents as well as the Pope. That was first Alexander Borgia and then from 1503 onwards Julius II. All of these parties had their own interests, much of which involved freezing out, if not destroying, the Republic of Venice. But only one of them thought it would actually happen, and that was Philip the Handsome. Philip was, as it happened, mostly handsome. His political nous was seriously underdeveloped. In his lifetime, he was not known as Philip the Handsome, but as Philippe qui croit conseil, Philip who follows his counselors. The Spanish ambassador wrote back in 1500 that Philip was obeying his main adviser, the Archbishop of Besançon, quote, more than I have seen a monk obey his superior. And these Netherlandish councillors were either genuinely convinced that France was a reliable ally or had been excessively bribed by Louis XII, or both. Philip did not mind. He liked to hunt and party, he was charming and well liked, but he had no own political convictions, and he did not ever understand that France could never ever tolerate an assertive, strong Burgundian state in its rear. And that's why he spent most of 1501 discussing this mega marriage with Louis XII instead of making for Spain and making France. Cozying up to France was much more up his street than the complexity of Spanish politics, a place he had not yet visited, where he did not speak the various languages and just generally had not much interest in. Moreover, his advisers wanted to keep him in the still fragile and fragmented Netherlands, fearing a prolonged absence of the prince could result in uprisings or invasions. And then there was always the problem of Gelders. And there was an intense debate between him and Ferdinand of Aragon over which route to take. Shall they go by sea or shall they go overland through France? Ferdinand wanted them to go by sea, because he feared that the French king, who he was about to fight a war over Naples with, would heavily influence, even apprehend the heirs to the Spanish crown. But Philip did not fancy a winter crossing of the Bay of Biscay, and he believed Louis XII, his chosen ally and the future father-in-law of his son. And so Philip and Juana travelled overland, enjoyed balls and festivities at the French court, before they finally appeared in Spain in January 1502. And again, on the face of it, things went all right. Juana was recognized as the heir to Castile and Leon, and Philip as her prince consort. They celebrated grand entries into cities and confirmed ancient rights, thereby gaining the approval of the key players for their succession. And the same happened in Aragon towards the end of that year. But then at the same time, things had not been all right. The mutual infatuation of the couple had become increasingly one-sided. Philip, handsome as he was, attracted the attention of many a lady at his court, and, not being a serious person, indulged heavily. This was something not at all uncommon, and the wives of reigning princes had been trained to endure it all with a smile. Juana may have received that same training, but it had not stuck. Juana did not accept the presence of mistresses, something her mother had been known to have done as well. But Juana's powers were very limited, even compared to other princely consorts. Though she was promised an annual sum to support her household, that money was never paid. Without such funds, she was unable to establish her own circle of patronage, which would have given her influence over the politics at court. This combination of political agony and inability to control her husband's philandering seem to have weighed heavily on her. Her behaviour became somewhat erratic. She once cut off the hair of one of Philip's mistresses and even allegedly disfigured her with scissors. She had tantrums, screaming uncontrollably at her household and Philip, who then locked her up in her room. There she resorted to what we would call today hunger strikes as a way to force her readmittance to court. Now Juana is best known by her moniker the Mad or Juana la Loca, suggesting she was suffering from serious mental health problems. Historically this was diagnosed as schizophrenia, mainly based on an analysis by a German scholar, Ulrich von Hutten. But this notion was challenged by Bethany Aram in her excellent book, Juana the Mad, Sovereignty and Dynasty in Renaissance Europe. Aram argued that Juana's sense of helplessness and desperation pushed her into these behaviors, like fasting, that had religious, if not saintly, connotations rather than suggesting madness. Her alleged madness was, according to Aram, predominantly a political tool employed by the men in her life, her husband, her father, and finally her son, as a means to keep her away from actual power. Now I can only recommend reading her book, if only for the parallels she draws with Ernst Kantorowicz's idea of the two bodies of the king, and anyone who refers to him gets my thumbs up. Most recent scholarship tries to tread a middle path. There are sufficient signs of excessive behavior that suggest inherent mental health issues, but that the treatment of her had exacerbated those until she reached full-scale psychosis. I do not have the time, nor is it the job of this podcast to offer an opinion on this heatedly debated question. What interests us here is how the Habsburgs got hold of Spain, and it is in this context that Juana is incredibly important. Therefore, let us get back to the first journey of Philip and Juana to Spain. The one thing that irritated Philip was his role as prince consort, pointing out again and again that his position in Spain derived solely from the claims of his wife. And then there was the broader political situation. France and Spain had initially agreed to split Naples up between themselves, but that agreement was falling apart during the course of 1502, and in 1503 all-out war broke out between France and Spain. Philip now found himself in an awkward position, given he was consort of the heir to the Spanish kingdoms, and at the same time a close ally of Louis XII. Ferdinand and Isabella had tried to convince him to declare for Spain. After all, this was his son's future realm. But Louis XII at the same time dangled the prospect of the marriage of little Claude and Charles before him. Philip, as always depending on his Burgundian advisers, decided that he would return to Flanders before hostilities broke out in full, aka not declaring for the Spanish. His wife was heavily pregnant at the time, and so her parents refused to let her join Philip on the journey. For the following 10 months, Juana was prevented from going to Flanders and rejoin her husband, presumably as a tool to force Philip to declare for Spain. Juana then tried to leave in secret, so Isabella locked her daughter up in a castle. Juana was incensed and oscillated between, again, hunger strikes and standing on the walls of the castle all through the night. In the midst of all this, Juana gave birth to a son. The boy was called Ferdinand after his Spanish grandfather, and would grow up at his court, whilst her other children grew up in the Netherlands at the court of Philip's sister Margaret of Austria, she who everybody believed had vigorously helped propel Prince Juan into the afterlife. It was only in 1503, after Ferdinand's armies had fought a great victory over the French, that Juana was given permission to return to the Netherlands. Now the next key moment in the saga came when the formidable Isabella of Castile, wife of Ferdinand of Aragon and mother of Juana, died in 1504. Remember that she was the Queen of Castile in her own right. Her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, had no legal rights to the throne of Castile at all. As established by the Cortes in 1502, the heir to her throne was Juana, and after her, her eldest son, Charles. That being said, the testament Isabella left behind was an extraordinary document. In it, she acknowledged that Juana was the heir to the kingdom, and after her, her son Charles, but she included a very unusual clause, which read as follows, quote, "And also, in case upon my death the said princess, my daughter, is not to be found in my kingdoms, or being in them does not wish to or cannot govern them, it is then established that in such cases the king, my lord, should rule, govern, and administrate my kingdoms and estates on behalf of the aforementioned princess, my daughter." End quote. Basically, her mother had given carte blanche to everyone to sideline Juana. If she rebelled in her usual way, well, the only way that she had in the absence of any money, people could take that as a sign of her madness, whilst if she did not reject the idea, well, then she would be sidelined anyway. That is enough to make one mad. It was also a slap in the face of Philip, who, as prince consort and father of the ultimate heir Charles, should be the administrator of the kingdom in case of Juana's incapacity, not her father Ferdinand. So why did Isabella do it? Isabella realized that Juana was clearly under Philip's spell and would ultimately do whatever Philip wanted. She and her husband were concerned that a foreign ruler would treat Spain as a secondary holding, like Spain treated Naples and Sicily. And Philip had made quite clear that he did not care much about Spain and Spanish customs. Even more importantly, Philip's insistence to return to Flanders in 1502 and reluctance to back his in-laws in their conflict with France had made him out as someone whose interests, instincts, and allegiances were at odds with Ferdinand's. Hence, if Isabella died and Philip then ruled Castile and Ferdinand Aragon, the two kingdoms would once again drift apart, undoing decades of consolidation work. In practice, Isabella's testament now pitted Philip against Ferdinand and placed Juana in between her husband and her father. If Ferdinand wanted to rule Castile, he needed to prove that Isabella was unfit to rule, whilst Philip, who until now had insisted that Juana was incapacitated, now had to take the opposite position, whilst at the same time keeping her under tight control. And this latter strategy became increasingly hard to sustain. Ever since Juana had returned from Spain, marital relationships had deteriorated even further. Philip tried to constrain Juana by cutting her off from her Spanish entourage. Juana responded by sending a letter to her father endorsing his takeover of the Kingdom of Castile on her behalf. Hearing of that, Philip then placed his wife in solitary confinement with no contact to the outside world. She did manage to call one of Philip's senior advisers to come in for a meeting, and when that elderly gentleman arrived, she attacked him with a metal bar. So by 1506, Philip was of the view that he had finally broken his wife's will, making it possible for him to travel to Castile, present her to the Cortes, and then claim the throne as consort. What is totally bewildering to me is that despite these constant fights and her really brutal mistreatment, Juana was constantly pregnant throughout her marriage, suggesting that there must have been at least occasional moments of conjugal harmony. At least one would hope so. Anyway, this time they went by ship, assuming that it would be quicker. Time was of the essence, since the grand plan of a marriage between the little boy Charles of Burgundy, Austria, and Claude of France had, surprise, surprise, been called off. All these negotiations and promises of world domination for the House of Habsburg had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. All that Louis XII had wanted was recognition from Maximilian as rightful Duke of Milan, which he received, and time to recover from the loss of Naples in 1503. Once both of these objectives were achieved, Louis married Claude to Francis of Angoulême, the future King Francis I. And Louis got involved in the struggle over the Spanish inheritance. The King of France now sided with his previous arch-enemy Ferdinand of Aragon against his former best friend, Philip the Handsome. This is again Machiavelli in action. And to drive a dagger into Habsburg ambition, Louis had furnished the aged Ferdinand with a new wife, Germaine de Foix. Now, if she were to bear the old King of Aragon a son, that son would definitely inherit Aragon and may even seize Castile as well. Bottom line was that Philip needed to get down the Bay of Biscay pronto. He set off in January 1506 from Holland, but got caught in one of the worst storms anyone had seen that pushed him all the way back to England, where his badly damaged flagship made landfall. And that was a godsend for King Henry VII of England. The English king had been nagging the Habsburgs for two things. One was the handover of another Yorkist pretender, Edmund de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, who had found refuge in the Netherlands. And he wanted a favourable trade deal with Flanders. Neither of these were things Philip wanted or should have parted with easily, so he refused. Ignoring his refusal, King Henry VII kept entertaining the couple in a lavish fashion, but told the shipyards to delay the repair of the Burgundian fleet and instructed the coast guard to intercept any of their ships trying to leave. For months, Philip and Juana were stuck in England, effectively very well treated hostages. Only when Philip signed a massively disadvantageous trade agreement, quickly dubbed the malus inter cursus, and handed over the unlucky Earl of Suffolk, were they allowed to leave. So it took until April 1506 before they could arrive in Spain. But that is where their fortune seemingly improved. The senior lords of Castile had found the hasty marriage of Ferdinand an affront to their former queen Isabella. Moreover, Ferdinand had tried to implement administrative reforms that reversed some of the handouts to the senior nobles under Isabella's reign, and generally aimed at tying the two kingdoms closer together. So when Philip arrived, the Castilians saw an opportunity to get rid of the old wily fox of Aragon and fleece the feeble Philip for all he, or more precisely his wife, was worth. To their own surprise, the couple were welcomed by all the high and mighty lords of Castile. They swore allegiance to their queen Juana and her handsome consort. The two of them entered one grand city after another in great pomp, and within just weeks had control of the kingdom. And then Philip did something that terminally tainted his already not exactly splendid reputation. Given the marital tensions were not likely to resolve themselves any time soon, even though they had been calmed down for the moment, and Isabella's testament had been unambiguous inasmuch as it did not allow for his guardianship of Castile, he needed his wife, who was once again pregnant, to be neutralized. So he got together with Ferdinand and made a deal. Ferdinand, who saw little chance to shift opinion in Castile and also had issues in Naples to deal with, recognized Philip and Juana as king and queen of Castile. In exchange, he received a generous pension that cut deep into Philip's pockets. And her husband and her father together declared Juana insane and confined her to the palace of Tordesillas. Juana reacted again by oscillating between uncontrolled rage and deep depression. This ultimate betrayal by the husband she loved and the father she admired was probably what tipped her over the edge. With the succession crisis now resolved in a manner of speaking, Philip settled into his role as sole ruler of Castile. The nobles who had received him so enthusiastically soon cooled in their affections. Philip, as we have heard many times before, only really trusted his Netherlandish advisers, who he rewarded lavishly with Spanish lands and titles. His court was an unending sequence of dazzling festivities, all funded by rising taxes. The Flemings, as the Spaniards called them, were quickly hated by everyone, and Philip's reign was about to descend into crisis. And by the way, Ferdinand had gathered his key advisers immediately after he had made this deal with Philip and got them to witness him, declaring that he had been forced to sign and that he would of course continue to fight for the rights of his beloved daughter, etc., etc., pp. So a civil war was literally about to break out when Philip suddenly caught a severe fever. He had always been prone to stress-related illnesses, and this time the combination of the hostility of his father-in-law, the lost grip on the Castilian nobles, demands of his father to facilitate his coronation journey to Rome, the Spanish climate, and some kind of viral infection did for him. Well, or maybe he was poisoned. Anyway, he was gone. What followed is the most famous part of this story. Juana was released from her jail and was now Queen of Castile. She ordered that her beloved husband, was not yet to be buried. She travelled all over her kingdoms with the coffin and had it opened only at night to kiss the man she had loved on his cold lips and who she now had all to herself. I have no intention of going any further into this gory story, but suffice to say, the Castilian nobles realized that their queen was in no state to rule them. They reluctantly called on Ferdinand to take back the reins of the kingdom on behalf of the ultimate heir. At this point, Spain could well have been lost to the Habsburgs. Ferdinand was back in control of Castile and obviously of Aragon. Maximilian was 1,000 miles away in Austria with no money or allies to intervene. Plus he had to shore up the family position in the Netherlands first. And just to get an idea on how poor Maximilian really was, he couldn't even fund the cost of the cloth to clad his court in mourning. Meanwhile, Ferdinand was 54, old of his age, but he still had another 10 years in him. His wife, Germaine de Foix, was 17, 18, something like that. So children from this relationship were possible even though their first child died within just 2 days. And even if they could not have any children, if Ferdinand had cared only about keeping the Habsburgs out, I'm sure there would have been some remote cousin in the Trastamara family who could be dressed up as the true-born Spanish heir. And last but not least, there was little Ferdinand, the second son of Philip and Juana, who was growing up as a Spaniard at the court of his grandfather. Why none of these scenarios happened is a true mystery. Most books I read on this simply say that Ferdinand and Maximilian came to an arrangement whereby Ferdinand accepted his grandson Charles' right to inherit both Castile and Aragon in exchange for his lifelong regency over Castile. Even Hermann Wiesflecker, and apologies for calling him Wiesecker in the last episode, devotes merely 2 paragraphs in his 5-volume, 2,500-page magnum opus to these crucial negotiations. Given the long-term repercussions of Habsburg's inheritance of Spain, digging into this matter looks to me like the mother of all dissertations. So, whilst we do not know how it happened, we do know that it happened. Ferdinand was given the rule over Castile, and he kept the rule of Aragon until his death in 1516, without any interference by Maximilian or any other Habsburg. And he was quite successful at it. His political and administrative measures forged the 2 kingdoms ever closer together. Through his second wife, he acquired the part of the Kingdom of Navarre south of the Pyrenees, thereby completing the consolidation of Spain. And of course, he promoted the expansion of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, though the great riches of Mexico and Peru would only be seized after his death. When then the heir to all of this, the famous Charles, arrived in Asturias in 1517, his subjects initially thought that they had seen an enemy fleet arriving. This young man, who had grown up in the Netherlands and did not speak a single word in any Iberian language, was received hesitantly by his new subjects. The dreaded notion that a foreigner would take over and make Spain an appendix, a mere source of men and material for adventures in Italy and Germany, was about to become reality. So they gathered around Charles' brother, young Ferdinand, who was more Spanish than Habsburg in any respect. Therefore, one of Charles's first acts was to send Ferdinand away to Austria, where he would spend most of his career. Charles himself only stayed for 2 years, irritating everybody by appointing his trusted Netherlandish advisors, them again, to all the key positions. In 1519, Maximilian died and Charles headed back to Germany for his coronation in Aachen. As soon as Charles was gone, revolt broke out. This revolt, known as the Revolt of the Comuneros, was driven mainly from the cities Valladolid, Tordesillas, and Toledo. They objected to the expenses of the court, the taxes raised to fund Charles' election as Holy Roman Emperor, and the appointment of the Netherlanders to high office, in particular that of a 20-year-old Flemish nobleman as Archbishop of Toledo. All this weighed heavily on a country whose economy had suffered from the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims. But underneath this revolt were an even deeper source of discontent, about the rapacious Castilian nobles who were encroaching on the rights and territories of the cities. So the revolt quickly took on a distinctly anti-aristocratic tinge, making some people call it the first real revolution. Still, the comuneros sought legitimacy for their actions. They claimed they were acting in defense of the rights of, drumroll, Juana of Castile, Charles' mother and the true heir and officially queen alongside her son. By then, Juana had spent the previous 10 years locked up in the palace of Tordesillas. But when the city representatives approached her, Juana refused to return on her son, and she was put back into her cell. Though the revolt gained traction amongst many of the cities in the center of the Iberian Peninsula, ultimately the royalist forces, which were effectively the nobles of Castile, won out. At the Battle of Vilalá in 1521, the revolutionaries were defeated, and the center of the uprising, Toledo, surrendered the following year. When Charles returned to Spain in 1522, he had learned his lesson. By now, he had mastered Castilian Spanish, had replaced his Netherlandish advisors with locals, and spent the next 7 years consolidating his power over Spain, a power the Habsburgs would maintain for almost 200 years, and that gave them the resources to rise to the top of the political tree in Europe. And what about Juana? Her son had visited her only twice, and gave the order that, quote, "It seems to me that the best and most suitable thing for you to do is to make sure that no person speaks with Her Majesty, for no good could come of it." End quote. She spent the rest of her life in isolation in the palace of Tordesillas until her death in 1555, aged 75, her condition deteriorating further and further. Next week, we will look at what our friend Maximilian was up to during that period, namely how he navigated the still ongoing Italian wars, in particular his fight with the King of Fish, as he called the Doge of Venice in his fictional autobiography, The Weisskönig. Join us again in another tale of highfalutin plans and dismal execution. And in the meantime, go get printing History of the Germans artwork on your mugs, your phones, and your outerwear. I've put a link to the merchandise site into the show notes. And once you're at it, why not stop by at historyofthegermans.com/support.